Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy Friday 13th in particular. And welcome to Baltimore Racial Justice Action's 13th of the month event. We're super excited to have you all here on a lovely Friday. This is the first of a series of events, of a 3-month grounding series. And this month, we're going to be focusing on the intellectual and analytical foundations of our work, particularly around anti-racism and anti-oppression, or ARAO, analysis, and exploring the theory of the contact zone. So we're super excited to have you here for this event, and we hope to see you in the April and May event. Um, for some folks who might not be new, you might be used to some of our 13th of the month events, and usually there are like panels. There's, of course, a lot of like a main topic and discussion. But for today's event, we are going to be hopefully creating a learning community. And so the purpose of this learning community is to foster collaboration as well as to develop analysis together. So I want to thank you all for coming. I'm going to actually hand it off to Dana who was going to get us started. Thanks.
Welcome everybody. I'm so excited about tonight's event. Um, so we're trying a different vibe. Instead of experts on a panel, audience out here, we're trying what does a learning community look like? And we're very aware that building a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-leveled learning community is difficult and it's super exciting. Um, And then, all that being said, even though we are trying to co create, we are trying to have lots more participation from folks rather than the inner circle decides it all and just sort of lets you all participate. We are rooted in BRJA history and we are rooted in anti racism, anti oppression analysis, aka ARAO. Um, if you have been in BRJA spaces in the past few years, you know that we use that acronym a lot. So we're constantly talking about ARAO this, ARAO that. And we also say it real fast so it sounds like a word rather than an acronym. Um, you may also have noticed that we do not always explain what that analysis is and how you might be hearing it in the conversations we're having and how you might want to use it in your spaces that you're in outside of BRJA to help with your analysis of the world, what's going on. Um, so we are planning on grounding ourselves in ARAO analysis at every 13th event. Usually it'll just be a little bit at the beginning and end. It's not going to be as much as I'm going to talk tonight, but this is the intro to it. I just read this How We Get Free. This book, you've probably seen it at bookstores. It's always popping out there. It is amazing. Bring this up because Dr. Margot Okazawa Ray was part of the Combahee River Collective and was the founder of an organization called the Anti-Racism, Anti-Oppression Education Network in Washington, D.C. And some of our founders, including Dottie and Adar, took a workshop with her in 1996. And so that's the first in those boxes of Xeroxes that I can find anti-oppression, anti-racism, anti-oppression all together. Anti-racism, obviously a much older thing, but this formation, when you put them together and it means a certain thing, is coming from Dr. Okazawa Ray and others. Um, so yeah, we've been thinking at BRJA about the way that 2026 is rolling out, the way 2025 has rolled out. Um, Manifestations of systems that have been churning for decades, churning for centuries. This is not new. What we're seeing is not new, and yet it is at sort of hyper intensity, hyper speed. And Dottie keeps saying we can't go back. And that is part of what we're trying to do with this grounding series is really think about what systems have brought us here and where we're trying to go that's somewhere different from back to say 2020 to 2024 when the levels of violence were also crazy high, just not quite so extreme and spectacular as some of what we're seeing right now. Um, So what is this thing ARAO? I think if you needed the 30-second version, it would be we always talk about naming and centering race and racism and racial analysis. We always talk about power and how power is racialized and how power moves at all kinds of different levels from interpersonal to large structural levels. And using historical and sociological understandings to talk about systems and structures. And so, again, this systems and structures thing, and that as distinct from the way individuals move, but related, is really important because always looking up to what those things are tends to give us a better view of what's happening. Um, I will say also, lastly, that I'm a theory nerd, and so sometimes words that are too big come out of my mouth, and we can talk about what those mean. All right, so I want to talk about AR and AO. So starting with AO for a minute, because Combahee huge insight, well, one of them was this concept of interlocking oppressions. And so we all hear about intersectionality, and Kimberly Crenshaw started talking about that in a particular kind of way. But before that was this interlocking oppression thing. And I like it because it focuses on oppression. Sometimes when we talk about intersectionality, this question of identity can get a little murky, and all of a sudden, white women are having some kind of intersectional feminism, and we don't find that particularly useful. So, this question of how oppressions interlock and work together is one of the things we want to think about. And to give you an example, at the end of this book, there's a little interview with Angela Davis. And she was in different circles from the Combahee people who were on the East Coast, but some of the same kinds of dynamics were coming up. So, for example, she described somebody asking her, was she black or was she a woman? And now, to us in 2026, if you're moving in these kinds of circles, that seems like a stupid question, also very offensive. What is that? What is happening here? But that was the kind of lack of analytical rigor, lack of analytical focus that they were addressing, and why their work was so important. And I think I will say just that we see this a lot today as well. If you're in any white leftist spaces, you often see that they are not talking about race, or they will kind of talk about race quickly as if it's kind of self-evident and then move on. It's not really important analytically. You sometimes see black moderate spaces that don't want to talk about capitalism. We're trying in this anti-racism, anti-oppression analysis to kind of harken back to what Combahee was doing in terms of all these things are important. And so we need to be raising all these different analytical lenses and see how they work together. So that's the really quick overview of the AO part. I want to deal a little bit with why it's ARAO, because there are groups that just talk about an anti-oppression analysis, but in BRJA we talk about ARAO like Dr. Okazawa Ray taught us. And so the idea is that anti-racism is situated within the larger context of anti-oppressions. So we address all oppressions, we talk about them, but the central focus is on racism and the way it can flow through all the others. I also want to talk then about how racism works, because that's a very big analytical concept. In BRJA, we tend to look at white supremacy as a central force. We talk about it in a US context, but it is also operational in a global context. And it wouldn't be me if I didn't bring up Charles Mills and his book, The Racial Contract, because he talks about the way that white supremacy is a global political system that we don't talk about, but need to. This is a way of distributing power and resources. It's important. We also talk about anti-blackness a lot. And the ways in which neither whiteness nor blackness are really symmetrical with other racial categories. They tend to kind of stick out for different reasons. Anti-blackness also holding a unique position in how power is organized, how domination, violence, resources are meted out. And then we get to something which I've heard fairly frequently over the years, which is the question of, why does BRJA have such a black-white binary? And this is something we'll probably come back to in this emerging learning community a fair amount, but I would say that first off, I don't really think about it as a binary. I think about it as polarity. Like, you have poles on a magnet, and there's attraction and there's repulsion, and sort of organizes how power works. And I think in the United States, this is true. Globally, this is true in different ways. I would also say that it doesn't mean that's the only polarity that is happening. So there are plenty of others. If you're looking at immigration debate right now and the way in which are you a citizen, are you not a citizen, how racialized that is, and that relates to whiteness certainly, but not always blackness. So the way those polls work, I think, is complicated, and it is additional to blackness and whiteness, which are kind of central in a way. Um, One more layer of that is that in a US context, African American experience, analysis around oppression of African American people, analysis of freedom struggles coming from African American people is really important in the United States context, and really important to talk about and also center within concentric circles around how racism works. Um, and I would say one other thing about this really quickly, and that is that when, in particular, white people, I am a white person, when we talk about oppression, we tend to drift away from talking about race if we can. And then if we are talking about race, we will often drift away from talking about blackness. We will drift away from talking about African American folks. So if you'll notice, white people love to talk about people of color rather than saying black people if that's who they're talking about, because it is less direct. It allows us to evade some things that are in the end really difficult to talk about, and that's an important thing for the learning community. Um, okay, two more things, and then I am wrapping it up. Um, I wanted to come back to the AO for a moment. So Combahee, as I said, that with this interlocking oppression thing, really brought a lot of complexity to their analysis. And they mentioned two things, amongst other things, as being really important. And one is capitalism. One is the way we look at racial capitalism as a force. And I wanted to read a quick quote by Barbara Smith, who was one of Combahee's members. The reason Combahee's black feminism is so powerful is because it's anti-capitalist. One would expect black feminism to be anti-racist and opposed to sexism. Anti-capitalism is what gives it the sharpness, the edge, the thoroughness, the revolutionary potential. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we're talking about ARAO. And especially, again, in 2026 right now. The last thing I wanted to highlight was also that they were internationalists. So this question that sometimes comes up in circles around, well, why are we talking about Sudan or Gaza or something that's over there? We have enough problems over here. And their analysis was very clearly that all of these are, again, still interconnected and interlocking, and they all matter. And so that's a thing. Often, and BRJA's analysis focuses on the US context for a lot of reasons, one of which is we live in the US. But I think as we are looking into this learning community this year, I think larger questions around what are the global ramifications might be helpful for our learning process. Um, all right, thank you all so much. I'm going to pass to Lawrence now.
So my name is Lawrence. I work with an organization called Leaders of Beautiful Struggle. We're a grassroots think tank does political advocacy from an explicitly Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist perspective, and that'll be relevant to some of the comments that I'll be making. We worked on a lot of issues, police accountability, getting money to grassroots organizations, reparations for the war on drugs, and the work actually comes out of World of Debate. So debate is like a high school and college policy debate. It's a competitive two-person form of debate. You have one topic for the whole country, which means that you can have debate tournaments like you have the NCAA March Madness, where schools come from all over and debate each other, and you have a champion. And this idea of contact zones actually comes out of a debate we had in debate because um, this debate community was actually Black people started coming into this world of policy debate. There are multiple flavors of debate. It's not like the great debaters. This form of debate was basically co-opted, created by West Point, the military academy, and co-opted by the Cold War to produce Cold War think tank policy warriors. So this is the type of debate that Liz Warren did. Very technical, very focused on anything you talk about, economic decline, education, you all link it back to nuclear war. And there's a culture within the space that was not conducive to Black and brown people talking about issues that impacted their lives. So when George Soros actually invested a large chunk of money to bring Black and brown people into the space, but he didn't have any training around how to bring Black and brown people into a space that was essentially coded and pedagogically designed to produce white supremacist Cold War think tank policy people who do things like literally plan the bombing of Iran. Like that's what we're trained to do in debate. Um, but in that space, Black and brown elders brought in critical race theory into that space. But because there was no institutional support for that move, the Black and brown students in that space kind of drifted the critical race theory towards versions of talking about race that really appealed to the judges who were coaches from other schools, emotional, affective um, desires to be seen as good people. And the first two-person team of Black debaters to win both college debate national championships, their argument was make debate a safe space. Like they were Black queer men, literally talking about Wizard of Oz, Dorsey wanting to come home and make debate a safe space. And they won. They were the first two-person team of Black debaters to win both college debate national championships. But given the DEI backlash, their team was actually, the funding was cut. And so, because they were in Emporia State University in the state of Kansas. And what I think that symbolizes is that when you have a theory of safe space that is not tied to a theory of power, a theory of engaging community to protect things like these debate teams, then you're basically doing a form of politicking around safe spaces that actually leads to necessitates what we call cancel culture. So if someone, would say, look, I get you want to be safe in debate, but debate's not a safe space. Like these are academic institutions that are really these schools are hedge funds with universities attached to them, like Harvard, Northwestern. And if this debate stuff starts to get on their nerves, they will destroy all of us. If you would say things like that, debaters would say, you're violating my identity. I'm a Black queer person. I'm putting myself on the line here. How dare you tell me that I shouldn't talk about my identity in debate space? And even as a Black person, I would have anxiety because I'd be judging debates like this. And I'd be like, yeah, I want to validate your identity, but also you got to answer the argument, you know, and there'll be people mad at folks like me because sometimes I would vote for these arguments that say, look, I get you have a personal identity of oppression, but we have to think about the structures of power. And if your argument doesn't give me a theory of how we can build debate spaces that actually have productive contestation to help us theorize power effectively to change the world, then I'm just affirming your identity and it's hollow. And like I would vote against the teams that would bring in their identity and they would like after the debate be mad at me and like yell at me. And it's like, look, I'm sorry. Like there are serious things happening in this world that we have to use debate to theorize. And this was like 2013, 14, 15. So jump forward to 2025, where a lot of these teams have been impacted by the politics of DEI cuts, by the failure of safe spaces and the failure of cancel culture to actually make spaces safe. I think that's where I wanted to start because when I think people hear contact zones, and what I'm saying is that the contact zone, if politics is warfare, then a contact zone can be a space for us to expose ourselves to the techniques of war being used against us and techniques of battles we can use to ourselves to defeat those tactics and potentially even have sparring spaces between different people about how we use those techniques of political combat. And like sparring, it's not a fight. Sparring, if you've done any martial art, includes gloves, includes headgear, includes protective guide rails. And you don't just bring anybody to spar against you. Like, go to any boxing champion. He's not bringing people who hate him to spar against him because they're going to try to hurt him. He's bringing people who they know they can have a relationship with, but will spar hard, right? And I think that that's actually an alternative, I believe, to the failures of safe space and cancel culture. Because if we expose ourselves to alternative theories, if we begin to understand the thinking that other folks have, including other folks who are on the left who may think differently, then we won't be as triggered when we hear something that sounds like a theory that invalidates my humanity or invalidates my assumptive logic of the world. We will have some previous exposure to that, and we'll have space to have sought out how we can productively engage difference rather than trying to cancel it. So that's where I think the utility of contact zones are compared to safe spaces. Um, but along those lines, I think that's also why just some examples of what are some examples of political differences that have to be worked out in safe space or contact zones. So, for example, I think that there are fundamental assumptions that come out of my political worldview. 'Cause I think that's an assumption that we, as people who care about racism, we all kind of don't really have a strongest theoretical foundations to what we maybe think about the world, but we kind of feel what we feel should be the solution and kind of have a trajectory that we probably all agree on. And I think for us, given that our core foundation is that the people who are most harmed by oppression need to have the power to choose for themselves the mechanisms of redress. We're going to our theoretical foundations about how we think about oppression in the world and history are going to lead us to fundamentally different answers than a lot of people who also consider themselves anti-racist. And that doesn't mean that we're at war with each other. It means that we have to expose ourselves to the thought systems that lead to these different outcomes. So I'm trying to figure out just what I think is a good example of that. I think one example is when you think about cities like Baltimore, we cities like Flint, we hear a lot about how to fix these cities. And two things that I hear a lot about how to fix these cities is things like deal with the lead in the water, deal with the lead pipes, replace the lead pipes, um, and then figure out ways to invest in the city. So something like a high-speed rail. So this is something very common on many shades of like the Marxist or online progressive left. They talk about lead, being in the water for the schools and that impacting people's mental capacity. And the government being cheap and not wanting to fix the pipes, right? And that's a talking point you hear a lot. Um, and it's very interesting. And also just high-speed rail being an example of an investment that would actually improve communities. And the fact that you hear the talking point about lead pipes so often is interesting because lead pipes, lead water is not the main ways through which people are exposed to lead poisoning. And I think that would be surprising for people because we hear so much about Flint and lead pipes, even in Baltimore. It's actually lead paint. So what you would actually need is not a massive attempt to get rid of the lead in the pipes. You would actually need to hire like thousands of workers to come through and strip the lead out of these old row homes. And that's a lot more difficult. But the critical thing that I believe explains why you don't hear about that is that the people pushing the argument to replace the pipes are union pipe fitters who are predominantly white. And so a union campaign to replace the pipes would have interest convergence, if we know about Derek Bell critical race theory, with a very large white progressive entity, these pipe fitters unions, and hiring a cadre of they would probably be black and brown people to like do lead remediation on these houses. There's no union for that. Those would be black and brown people that would have to be paid, but they wouldn't go through a union. Right. So that's an example for me of we can respect unions, but understand that the racial exclusion of Black people from unions, and that's not a critique of unions per se, it's just reality, because we know unions work by seniority. So if unions were segregated, there were just white people by definition had seniority. And we also know just the nature of the social relationships in unions. White folks get their kids a union card when they're 18. So by the time they're 28, they have 10 years of seniority. And if you're Black folks, you might be formally incarcerated. The apprenticeship pipelines to unions have been very meticulously crafted to go to people who are the sons of people who have seniority. So just by people trying to take care of their kids and their cousins and their family, that replicates the racism within the racial exclusion within unions to make it so that we as Black people have had to circumvent unions oftentimes for our economic survival. And for that, Black people have been called Black capitalists, as opposed to recognizing that some of the needs we have may not fit within the union system, which itself is a vestige of capitalism, right? So I think that's just one example of how my theory and understanding of the world of Black community self-determination would be that I would lean more towards how do we get a cadre of people who are like formerly incarcerated, for example? And how do we get the capacity maybe at a state and local level to pay for them to do like green housing remediation, fixing the roof, fixing the windows, but also scraping the lead out, as opposed to like a multi-billion-dollar lead paint campaign. And it's not necessarily either or, but the reality is when it comes to decision-making power, it actually is zero sum. Like two people, we can have all the money in the world. We can have a Marxist revolution and have all the wealth redistributed to the masses. But when it comes to decision-making power on critical issues, you actually do need to have a debate within the left as who has power to make the decision. And the high-speed rail is an example of that. So if we have high-speed rail, like maglev trains, that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar construction project that's probably going to go predominantly to unionized labor, which is predominantly white, and also not local oftentimes. But more than that, the high-speed rail is a perfect engine to gentrify a city like Baltimore. So even again, if we had a perfect Marxist redistribution of wealth, unless we totally ended capitalism, the possibility of that train gentrifying Baltimore would have huge impacts on Black Baltimore in a way that unless we as Black people have the power to say no to it, then we are stuck even in this Marxist utopia suffering under the realm of gentrification, right? So I think that's just another powerful example of my politics would say, just make the MARC train better. Like it's not sexy. It's not going to go viral on Instagram. Mom Donnie's not going to be able to make a TikTok of the slightly faster MARC train, but actually it would be better than a gentrification engine, which would be that MARC train to that the maglev train to DC and Philly, right? So I think those are just examples of cultural theoretical realities that both show the need to have debates between versions of the left that show the need for contact zones and also show the need to why the black-white binary may be a useful theoretical intervention, even as we try to figure stuff out on the left. Because what we hear a lot is we need to have multiracial coalitions. We get that Black people have been oppressed, but a lot of people have been oppressed. Capitalism oppresses everybody. So we should have multiracial coalitions because we need to unite the left. And Black people's commands for self-determination fractures the left is the phrase they used in the 60s, right? And I think that a historical analysis that I get through things like ARAO, to me, it's been very useful to have some historical grounding in a global analysis of power, an analysis of power beyond America to global Blackness and global anti-Blackness, and therefore helping to theorize the utility of the Black-white binary. So in the piece, that actually the concept of contact zones comes from. The example they use is a Native American person from Latin America who converts to Christianity, actually writing to Spanish missionaries, basically in their indigenous language, exposing them to some of the realities of everyday life in the Spanish colonies, which they had colonized, but also sort of critiquing them by saying, like, you bring us Christianity, we have our indigenous customs, but the way you're treating us isn't very Christian. So just the fact that they are willing to write this letter to the Spaniards and ship it overseas is an example of folks in the imperial Spain who controls Latin America at the time having contact with this both engaging but also challenging perspective from someone who is a colonial subject. So that's one of the examples of a contact zone. And I think even within that example, it is useful for me to theorize from the historical perspective of the Black-white binary, because there was a debate in the Spanish imperial era of the 16th, 17th century as to whether Latin American people were actually human or naturally born slaves. So it's like Bartolome de las Casas was a person from the Spanish colonies in the New World who was a pastor who was trying to defend the humanity of the indigenous people of Latin America, and like that was a whole debate. And it's instructive because there was no equivalent debate for the enslaved Africans they brought over. So even as we theorize the reality of Spanish imperialism and capitalism driving imperialism and the slave trade, the fact that Black people, their humanity was not even up for debate, while people in Latin America was, is an example of the reality of anti-Blackness situating itself so deeply in our minds that the idea of Black self-determination, Black people having a culture, having indigenous cultural practices that were disrupted through imperialism, it's not necessarily natural even to a leftist to think that way. Because when your vision of being a leftist is that Black people are just so fundamentally oppressed that they've not been able to develop a culture besides oppression, then you can't theorize things like Black people were traveling the Atlantic Ocean and navigating the ocean in ships before Columbus. You can't theorize the historical trajectory of civilizations that was disrupted through slavery and imperialism. And you also can't theorize the cultural systems in Latin America of African people that were disrupted by Latin Americans. So, for example, in Colombia, the country of Colombia, you have Marxist rebels who are actually doing acts of violence to African people in Colombia because the Marxists want the African people to help them do things like narco trafficking, which they use to fight the fascist capitalist regime in Colombia. And the black people are like, we get it, but we're enslaved Africans. We have our own culture. We want to have our own settlements in the hills and on the Pacific coast where you just leave us alone. We want to be neutral and we want to be able to engage in our indigenous cultural practices without getting in y'all war per se. And some of those folks have been subject to violence from Marxist rebels, Marxist Latin American rebels. So those are just examples of things that challenge this assumptive logic around, you know, I think what's happening with the critique of cancel culture, and I'll try to wrap up, is we all have stuff we think, but we don't say it. And the idea of contact zone is we need to figure out how to construct spaces where people say that stuff. Because I've just gotten to the point where I just know what people think and I just say what I know people think and then I respond to it. And that comes from doing so much debate coaching, right? But it will be really, really useful for folks to have spaces where we talk about this stuff because there are very real political consequences to not having spaces to really talk about this stuff. And just, one example locally is we have so much conversation about perceived corruption within the mayor's department. And I hear progressives talk about, the mayor's hooking up his friends. And it's like, you do realize that talking point is coming from right-wing conservative Fox News. But these are folks that call themselves progressive. And I think, again, the assumptive logic is so deep around politicians take corporate donations, politicians hook up their friends within capitalism, they all sell us out. We need a fundamental revolution. And there's an element to that is true. But when you have things like, we have in Maryland money that comes from legal cannabis sales that goes to communities like Baltimore City, Baltimore County, PG County to repair the harm of the war on drugs. And that money is under local control. And we have progressives saying, I don't think you should have done that. I think you should have kept the money in Annapolis because we, the experts in Annapolis, the social justice experts, the anti-racism experts, we know better about how to spend the money and we can shield it from corruption. Right? So these are not Republicans, these are progressives passing bills undermining our theory of reparations, which again is the people that are most harmed should have the ability to choose for themselves the mechanisms of redress for that harm. And they're saying, no, we need to have more mechanisms to oversee the money. We need to have more mechanisms to make sure that the people actually are spending the money in the right way. And that's not necessarily an easy question to answer because I can see both sides of that argument. But what I don't even really have is a space to really even explain that I didn't just think up one day, we should just give local control of the money to the reparations commissions. And the commission should be appointed by the city council. It was a very intentional decision to have these reparations commissions appointed by the city council people, not because we trust the city council people, but because they're the easiest people for the community to lean on. So you maximize political leverage by having a commission appointed by the city council. So because any of these politicians are corrupt, they all have their own interest. So if that's true, you pick the person who's easiest to lean on. And that's a city council person or county council person. And if they appoint someone to the commission you don't like, tell your county council person to get rid of them. Because if you get 100 people in your community that can lean on them, they have to pay attention. The mayor doesn't. The senator doesn't. The governor doesn't. And that's the theory behind local control of that money. It is not some Pollyannish romantic vision that the oppressed have some natural nobility for their oppression. It's an intentional political decision, not only sought up through a logical analysis of power, but through a historical analysis of the work of the Black radical tradition, including things like the work done in the poverty programs, Walter Carter, Baltimore Core in the 1960s, giving power to community to control where that federal money went that was undermined by folks like William Dowland Schaefer, who folks who are progressive sometimes don't always have enough smoke for, right? So I'll end it there because I think that that's mostly what I want to say. The very last thing I want to say is that the center and the right are constantly attacking the theory and practice of the left. And if we don't have enough, and we have analysis of the center and the right, but it's oftentimes very superficial, very flippant, and very personal. Like, oh, we know, and not just Trump, but like we know Ezra Klein is annoying. We know he's really a centrist that calls himself a progressive. But like, you have to give people more because these are multi-million-dollar institutions that regular people are just looking to for answers. And they have podcasts, they have YouTube shows. They are being literally interviewed by folks like Joe Rogan, who can then spread that propaganda to your friend who works at the Amazon warehouse. And we need to have spaces we can have more of a degree of specificity and rigor and depth for us to engage not just the theories of our enemies, but also the theories of each other, so we can have more space to really think through how we understand and relate to those theories. And if we have questions, we just got to say them, right? We have to build enough trust and build enough context to say, this is not cancel culture. Like, I am a human. You cannot invalidate my humanity. So I'm not tripping over you validating me at all. I want to know what you think. I want to know what you're hearing. So at the very least, if I'm doing something like pushing the Reparations Commission, the folks who call themselves progressives know at least enough to not be enemies to my work and understand my thinking enough to be like, I don't always all the way agree. I wish we had more oversight and we had more clawback provisions and more experts, but I get what they were doing. So just even at that basic fundamental level, information sharing, me demonstrating the Reparations Commission as a theory and you understanding it from that foundation gives folks context. And now we can have a conversation about, so you are concerned about this, I'm concerned about this. How do we hash it out? So I'll stop there. Thank you.